All right. So, hello, everybody. In the spirit of full disclosure, I will be sharing what I'm going to talk about real quick. So, my name is Jacob. I track CPS COVID data. I'm going to talk about sort of how that started, and then how I got into investigating some strange data with the help of some friends, and how I broke that story, and then the CPS response and fallout of that. Quite a bit of this story, full disclosure, takes place on Twitter. So there'll be a number of screenshots of tweets. Don't stress about reading them. I'll point something out if it's super important. And if Twitter's not your thing, sorry about that. So let's go ahead and dig in. So this story begins towards the end of 2020. I was working at Lurie Children's Hospital in the Special Infectious Disease Lab. We mostly did HIV, AIDS, RSV, influenza clinical trials, a lot of COVID clinical trials once they started having vaccines and therapies for those. It was a really exciting time. But as with most exciting times, sometimes you start to get a little bit burnt out. And I wanted to become a cloud engineer. That's not me. He looks very happy though to be a cloud engineer. That's what I imagine, anyways. Now I don't know how many of you have transitioned to a field of computer engineering without a computer science degree. But as I was trying to do that, I learned that you need to have some personal projects, sort of a portfolio that can show that you sort of know things, right? And so with CPS returning to school and promising to report COVID data, it reminded me of a project over at a cloud platform called A Cloud Guru, a cloud training platform, that involved building a data pipeline to power a COVID dashboard. Briefly, that's just sort of pulling the data from somewhere, manipulating it a little bit so that it's sort of more easily readable for your audience, and then putting that in a way that's easy to see. Now, at that time, the only COVID dashboard that I really knew of was this one here, the OG Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard. This screenshot was taken back in a happier time when there were only 100,000 cases in the whole world. So that's the dashboards that I was familiar with. And when I went to go look at CPS's dashboard, this is what it looked like. Now, that's not to make fun of it. This stuff's hard, but it just wasn't the dashboard that I wanted. It wasn't showing the data that I wanted it to be seen. You can see that there's no sort of aggregated data over time. It's just, week by week, starting at 0, broken down, adults and students. And then if you had any interest in knowing what was going on in a particular school, you had to select what week you were interested in, scroll down to your school. I believe this column was cases at that school, and this was number of quarantined individuals, or maybe quarantine pods. I don't know what they were sort of measuring at that point. And I wanted a map. I like maps. I wanted a map. So with the framework of the challenge in mind, I started working on the dashboard that I wanted. And using that sort of framework as inspiration, I started building. Now, this is a simplified architectural diagram for the two of you out there who might be interested in it like me. And this is showing it as it stands now. If you want more detail, you can reach out. So basically what happens is every 5 minutes, it kicks off a serverless function on AWS. It ingests CPS's data. It pulls my data from a storage bucket and sort of compares the two to see if there are any new cases. If there are any new cases, it modifies that data set, sends it back to the bucket to populate the website, and then it also sort of sends a summary out using a Twitter bot. And then it can also do it at the school level. If you select a school from this drop down, you can see sort of your school's cases as they rise. and sort of some information over the last couple days pertaining to your school. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to mention this is just for this audience, how cheap and performant this sort of serverless setup is. If I were to take away the website part itself, so not having a domain cost, not having a CDN cost, in its current configuration, this function that checks for new data every 5 minutes relentlessly, right, would cost about 50 cents a month. And that's excluding that it would probably be free, taking into account sort of the allowances that can be made on AWS. So I'm not trying to shill, but I just think that this is something that can be really useful for people who are interested in accountability to, collect the data that is required to study and keep bodies accountable. So in addition to tweeting out these summaries from this Twitter bot, one thing I did was, manually tweet from this handle to try to keep CPS accountable. See, they had promised that they were going to update their counts every Monday through Friday when school was in session. And, in order for my personal project that I was trying to use to get this first job in the cloud, I needed it to update. I needed it to work, right? So I spent a lot of time complaining about the lack of updates from CPS. In addition to that, I tried to add some context to the numbers that might be coming out of CPS here in the beginning of January, saying, noting sort of how many cases had just happened the first 2 days that we were back from school. And then this third tweet here, the tweet that sort of started it all. But before we really get into this one right here, I think that it's important to do just a little bit of housekeeping for some terms that I'm going to use. So I'm sure that many of you know what an API is. It's basically a way to ask a database sort of a predefined question. You can sometimes add parameters such as dates, or in this case, a school ID, right, to get the information that you want. I'm going to be referring to these in these short names right here. Just, when I say something like school weekly, school daily, district daily, think of it as sort of how the cases are aggregated. So on a school basis or a district basis, and then the interval at which the cases are aggregated, whether it's weekly or daily. And then also keep in mind that if school daily, you can just put in parameters to combine the appropriate days to make it into a week, right? There you go. All right, so back to this tweet that launched my investigation. So what I found on the CPS website, and here's just an example from Lane Tech, was that the school weekly API results right here were not matching the dashboards. On the school weekly graph over here, we can see that the last 2 weeks had 21 and 0 cases on the graph, but in the API, it had 35 and 37 cases. So more than 50 cases were missing from the dashboard that CPS was displaying for Lane Tech on their website. So that was weird. So I went into the dev tools and found that instead of using school weekly for the population of this graph, they were using school daily and aggregating them based on the week, but it still wasn't the right numbers, right? So I had a question, right? What's going on and how long has it been going on? So I wrote a script to compare school daily and school weekly, and found that while the data was good in December, and then I went back and went before December, but this graph shows December, the two APIs match very closely, right? And then once we hit January, they start splitting up. With the first week of January, there's a difference of 1,000 cases between school daily and school weekly. And the second week of January, there's 3,000 case difference. With school daily, right, the one that's populating the graphs that parents are seeing on the CPS website, showing these lower case numbers than school weekly. Now, I was initially concerned with my data, right? There, maybe the school weekly is broken, which is why they're using school daily to do this task that seems more appropriate for a weekly API, right? But when I added the district data, it matched the school weekly API, meaning that the school daily numbers were low and the school daily numbers shouldn't be low. And so the school graphs that were on the CPS website were showing that low number instead of that higher number. So what did this look like on a daily basis? So I can't split school weekly into days, so I scrapped that and just compared the school daily and the district daily numbers. And again, I'm combining all the schools within the district for each day, summing them together, which should equal the district daily number, right? But we can see as we go through time that eventually we hit January 3rd here, and the numbers match. This was the first day that kids were back at school, and then we hit January 4th, the next day, and cases no longer match and continue to not match, with again this lower number being what was displayed on the school graphs. Now, in the first place, I thought this was just scandalous, right? They're not showing the right numbers. But then, when I looked at this date, the 4th, I remembered, and you may remember if you're a CPS parent or a CPS employee, that was the day that the CTU announced that they were going to be teaching remote due to Omicron, the high prevalence of Omicron in the community. And CPS not liking being told what to do, told them no, right? So there was a CPSCTU dispute starting that night. And to me, that was plausible motivation for this change. And so I wanted to share this and get some impact and share it as widely as possible. Now, I knew from privately sharing sort of this graph and some of the other graphs with other people that I was going to need to add some context to build it up. So I started writing a series of tweets, a thread with the goal of optimizing the spread of the story. I started the thread with a juicy hook. I mean, it was a scandal after all, and wanted to make it compelling and interesting to people even outside of the CPS community. And because I wanted a wide audience who didn't know me from following me and my dashboard on Twitter for the past year, I introduced myself with the next couple tweets, laid out all the data similar to the way that I shared it with you just now, and then added some nice shareable tweets at the center. And I also didn't want to spend the next few days answering the same questions over and over again. So I responded in advance to some of the objections, some of the more reasonable objections that readers might have. I wanted people to know that I had done some amount of due diligence, exercise some academic rigor in my accusations, right? So I sent this thread shortly after work on the 20th, and pretty quickly my notifications started coming in faster than I could read them. The thread had really struck a chord with people. They were reading it and sharing it and finding a lot of validation in it. They may have gotten emails from their school about cases that were present in their building, but then they'd go and look at the official dashboards and not see those numbers there and just sort of think, what's going on here? Overnight, the story had gained enough steam that city representatives and people in government were demanding answers, and reporters, while maybe not endorsing my specific narrative, were confirming that they had also seen that the data was sort of strange and altered, and that CPS, when they had asked, had not been forthcoming with any sort of answers in the previous days and weeks. So after avoiding reporters, my story finally forced CPS to provide an answer. And they responded in a statement that they tweeted out. First, admitting to altering how the case data was shown without changing the legends of the graphs, but shrugging off the timing, saying that it had nothing to do with the CTU and had been done earlier on December 20th. They also said that they made the change to only cases that had been closed by contact tracers and as a way to protect privacy, and then ended the statement by casually saying that they're not even required to provide the data. Now, this is what we sometimes refer to on Twitter as a very bad tweet. This was a statement that was clearly made in a conference room by a bunch of lawyers trying to protect CPS from any sort of litigation in a court of law. But what they failed to do was realize that they were currently being tried in a court of public opinion, and this statement didn't do them any favors. Also importantly, it validated the admission validated my data, right? I had showed that they weren't showing the cases, and they admitted that they were showing the cases. And because I didn't have to defend my data anymore, I was able to shift focus to the consequences of the changes, the results of what they had done. The parents were being told lower numbers were happening at their school than really were. And I iterated on this during the interviews I had during that evening. And then finally, the story escaped Twitter and started being printed. Block Club was the first to publish, followed quickly by the Sun-Times, and they all started heavily leading with the consequences of the change and painting CPS's defense of it as pretty dubious. Once AP picked it up, the story was everywhere, and it escaped Chicago and was people were talking about it in lots of places. And importantly, people in other locations were finding the story on Twitter every day and saying, hey, do you think this is happening in Columbus? This seemed to be a common story that people were feeling throughout the country with their own school districts and the reporting. Now, over the next couple of days, CPS modified the legends in their graphs to sort of accurately depict what the data was actually showing. And they also spent a lot of time defending their decisions. At a board meeting, at a Board of Education meeting that week, they claimed that the changes were made to satisfy their goals of providing families with timely, accurate, and relevant data. And it really is mostly spin, right? So anybody who's worked with moving data knows that timeliness and accuracy are sort of pretty opposing forces, right? And getting the balance of timeliness and accuracy is how you achieve relevancy. Even if you really believe this spin, right, they clearly too heavily emphasized the accuracy of it. And in doing so, really gutted the timeliness of it and therefore the relevancy too. The following month involved, sort of mostly these same defenses and spin as well, and vague promises to add the data back. And about a month later, they did add the data back. They emailed everybody but me. I had to have someone forward it to me. This statement about how they were re-changing, re-adding the missing school data. Many parts of it were problematic, including this sort of revisionist history that's underlined here, saying that previously they had published only closed cases when they had been publishing all cases 2 months prior, and they were really just giving back what they had taken away. But they did return it improved. They broke the data into 2 sets that had once been one. One, the positive results originating from in-school screening, as well as the self-reported results that parents would, or students or teachers would supply via a questionnaire to disclose to the school that they had taken a home COVID test or something. In addition to that, they started to publish change logs on their web site and their API documentation. I mean, I think that this is a really great addition. I mean, it's clear that they're trying to be more forthcoming in how they're changing data. But the CPS data does still have its issues. For example, in February, I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for all of their January screening results, and compared that the results of those screening to the results that were displayed on their dashboard. And just briefly looking at this graph, you can see that by the end of January, there's about 3,000 cases missing that have positive results based on FOIA responses that are not showing up in the dashboards that CPS is showing. So that's 3,000 cases missing in January, and these are the cases that CPS heralded as more accurate and timely, and they're still not showing that data. In addition, their data management is just not great. These two graphs were taken at the same time, so they finally changed the school weekly API to be showing to power the weekly cases data. But you can see that the data don't match. The screen positive number here is 25. The positive number here is 40 because they're missing a week's worth of cases in their daily case graph. Why? I don't know, but it certainly doesn't seem super accurate and timely if it can't be corrected after 4 months. So the data is not fixed, but they're trying. They're doing a little bit better. But I'm going to keep pointing out on Twitter and asking them for answers. So what did I learn from this project and this experience? A couple things. The first one was to always be watching the data and watch something that you're interested in. My timing was pretty good. It was about a week after kids had returned to school. But because I had been sort of inside this data for the better part of a year, I could tell when things started getting weird. Since I had my finger on the pulse of parents complaining about how long it took to get COVID data showing up on the school dashboards, I could tell when that chatter increased, and I could investigate it, and I could uncover the story and take it seriously. Two, I didn't drown the general public with data, and that was hard. I love data. I'm guessing that most of us love data. The more graphs, data, charts, the better. But most people prefer a story and a narrative that they can relate to. And I think that one reason why the story was able to spread and to put pressure on CPS to respond to it was that I had created a story that people could relate to and that people could empathize with. And I think that me being able to sort of empathize with that struggle was very powerful. I made the story easy to share. Twitter is great for this, super easy to tweet. I specifically constructed and wrote some of the tweets to sort of be extra shareable by having sort of the thesis statement and a graph and relevant participants tagged. And I think that went a long way towards getting eyeballs on the story. Another thing I did was I continued engaging. I had released this on Thursday, went into Friday, and I knew I had to keep it alive all weekend. And so I sort of took every interview request, knowing that every time it airs on the radio, every article that's posted in a newspaper on the internet, that's more eyeballs that can see it, and the more pressure that's put on the district to respond to it. And I think that was really important. And then finally, sometimes I feel bad always ragging on CPS about their COVID data, but I believe that the COVID data is an important thing to get right and needs oversight. And so I'm not going to stop. But I also know that the people who are working at CPS are humans. And so when I notice something good, like this week, they added vaccine data to their dashboards and included an API and shared that and added that documentation, I praise it, because good data is important. And when people push that good data forward, that's important. So yeah, those are the things that I learned from this situation, and I'm going to keep digging. But there were a lot of people that helped with this. One of the big participants was the Shy Hack Night Slack, who I know that Lori had talked about the water cooler channel. There's somewhere in there is 100, reply thread about the story as new stories were released in real time. And I believe I asked for an adult to help me at one point. And so that was really helpful to have people who are used to this sort of thing to share that with. Yeah, and I'm done now. So I would love to take any questions.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Imagine applause on the Zoom. We do have some questions. So an audience question, kind of on the like tooling side. What
Sure.
mapping tools did you use to aid in your reporting effort?
So I use, I mostly am writing in Python, and I used so this would be mapping. So this would be the front end. So a JavaScript library called Leaflet I used for my maps, and they have some, overlays, and you can, loop through dictionaries to, populate things to either place them at certain locations on your map, coordinates. So I use Leaflet for that.
Another question, is there anything you would do differently looking back?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Probably, I think, well, one of the things that I struggled with was sort of after all this got started and the ball was rolling, a little bit out of my control. I thought about like, Jakob, what do you want? What do you want out of this? I didn't think that if anyone was fired over it, it would ever be the right person anyways, right? And so that was sort of something that I didn't want to happen. Nobody ever expected, the CEO or the mayor to resign, right? So like none of those things, were reasonable. And I think that if I could have come up with, and I still, the time's passed, right? So I don't know what that answer is. But if I think I should have come up with like an ask, right? What they could do to make it right and hammer on that. I think that would have been helpful in maybe getting results faster, and having people echo that. And, I sort of, once I transitioned to the outcomes and the consequences of them changing that data and not telling anybody, they sort of were able to easily fix that while not ever admitting that they had really screwed up, right? They put it in words like, sorry for the confusion. It's like, no, you changed a graph and didn't change the legend. That's a big deal where I come from. So I think I would have come up with an ask, right? That I think that would have helped a lot.
That makes sense. Another audience question, did you get sponsors to continue updating your data?
Yeah, well, so I have a, buy me a little coffee link at the bottom of my page that I don't tell people about. And if they, want to send me $5, they can. The cost of the site, as I mentioned, is pretty low to get it and maintain it. The biggest cost is my time, right? I have a family who likes me. So sometimes you need that a little bit of external motivation to keep on going. Interest is always nice. But it is gratifying that people will, thank you with money. And then also I had, somebody I knew had shared with the A Cloud Guru people that I had, used as sort of my template for this project. And one of the VPs over there gave me some AWS credits to keep doing it. But I don't know what to do with them. I haven't even cashed them in yet because my website's too performant. So if anybody out there wants to start using AWS for their stuff, maybe I'll give you a $50 credit or something.
That's funny. Okay, a bunch of audience questions coming in. So next one, if CPS had kept their daily and weekly data in sync, could this still have been detected? And that person says that they are a CPS parent. So
that's a really good question. I don't think so. So they were showing So the district data, also the district daily and the school daily were still separated. So they were showing sort of all the cases on their main dashboard. I think I actually might have noticed it sooner. So my dashboard was pulling in sort of all the numbers. And so from my perspective, everything sort of looked normal, looked sort of in line with what I wouldn't go to schools typically on the CPS dashboard. I might click on the main page, see that the total numbers are roughly matching my total numbers and be like, yeah, everything's fine, right? So if they had changed the weekly number, then I may have noticed faster. As it stood, I never talked about the school weekly API in the Twitter thread, because sort of I knew at that point that I was the only one with good school level data, and I didn't want them to stop that. I think I might have noticed it faster because everybody's talking about COVID. I'm getting the first day back at school, both of my kids got COVID letters that came home. And if I would have seen that day update and be like 15 cases, I would have been like, that's not right. Right. So they might have actually, bought themselves some time by not changing that.
Next question is, will you continue the project? Are you continuing the project?
Yes, I will. They recently, as I had mentioned, released sort of vaccine data. So I think I'm going to add that to my data set so that, I don't know what will come of it, right? There's a couple schools that have some outbreaks right now. Coonley, one of them, has had a bunch of cases. They were in the news the other day. They have a remarkably high vaccination rate, but it would be interesting to see sort of maybe that vaccination rate overlaid and be able to select that on the map. In addition, and this is something people have asked me for, and I think it's important, but I have to change the structure of my data, so it's a lot of work, right? But to add, student population data to the database so that you can see more of a per capita case rate. I like to, the dashboard always makes Taft and Lane Tech look bad, but they're huge schools, right? And my kid's elementary school doesn't look so bad, but if you look at the ratios of infections per student, my kids' elementary school is way worse. So being able to put those numbers in context and not sort of put larger schools at a disadvantage, I think would be interesting for some context. And then being able to select whether you want to show that data on that map, whether you want to show it at a 14-day range that I have now, a 7-day range, 21-day range, totals, things like that, to make that a little more interactive for people, I think would be nice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next question, did feedback that you were hearing from parents or teachers in real life inform what you were looking for when you were trying to understand the data discrepancies, and if so, how?
Not in real life. Until these stories broke, and I said they could use my name, I don't think anybody knew who I was. I after the first couple of news stories, I had people texting me saying, "You're that," so nobody was just talking to me about that. So no, nobody was saying anything in real life.
Another audience question: what harms were being inflicted by what CPS is doing in misrepresenting the data? I guess, so what is the impact?
Yeah, I think that there's always a harm in lying, which is sort of how I would categorize it when you say that the graph is one thing and it is actually a different thing. That's a harm to my, you know, like the core of what's right in the world, right? You know, it's just it's wrong, right? And so I think that that in general is a harm. But I think that one of the harms that sort of moves into not just ethical dilemma type stuff, is that people were using CPS's dashboard to try to get information on how to navigate the pandemic. And this was happening at, you know, COVID was everywhere, and people are having to make a decision about if they think it's safe to send their kid to school. And I'm not trying to make that decision for anybody. I don't know what people's situations are at home, whether, you know, they have a kid that just came home from heart surgery, right? Or a very elderly grandma who's living at home with them. I don't know. I don't know what's going on with people. And CPS doesn't know what's going on with people. And those people need to be able to make decisions that are right for them with good data, and not giving people, you know, tipping the scales to get kids back to school. You know, I can understand that there's education's important, but, you know, people should be able to make their decisions about the level of, you know, risk that they're willing to put, you know, grandma or dad or cousin or brother or sister in. And I think that that is a huge harm to people.
Yeah, so next one's not necessarily a question, but maybe kind of a comment. CPS parent who says that Northside has a high vaccination rate, and they'd be curious. They'd love to see the correlation between vaccination and cases that you mentioned. So
yeah,
a vote for that feature.
I think that would be super interesting. What's really funny, nothing's ever funny when you're talking about COVID stuff, right? But what's interesting is if you look at the map right now, it does look like there's way more larger and redder dots on the map on the north side compared to the south side. I don't know if that has to do with you know, the people who are more eager to take their masks off. That might be my guess, or what. But I think that the combination of vaccination information plus sort of balancing based on how many students go to a school could give some insight on that.
Sure. A couple other questions. So one, when you noticed that there were issues with the data, did you reach out to CPS directly? And like, did you have any direct communication with CPS at any point?
No, I mean, I've spent the last year DMing them questions and they never respond to me. So I didn't think that I was going to get any sort of response about that. I reached out to WBEZ and the Sun Times, and WBEZ sort of confirmed that they had noticed some problems in the data and had asked for answers and weren't getting anywhere. And so I was sort of like, well, they're not gonna answer me if they're not if they're not answering Sarah Karp, right? So, you know, in sort of a discussion with her, it was kind of like, you know, how long do I wait knowing that this is happening and nobody knows about it? Maybe telling everybody will light a bit of a fire under them and get things moving. And so that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. Another question, based on your experience here, what do you think makes for a good public dashboard or public data reporting? What advice or requests would you have for people who make dashboards or publish data from public agencies?
That's a good question. I mean, like my guiding light was sort of, what do I want to see what do I think is useful. Initially, that's the only thing that you can really do. You can try to get in the minds of people, but I don't know. I can't really get in the mind of other people. So I thought about what I'd want and made that. And then released it to the world and took feedback, right? And that was sort of how it's developed from then. It went from updating once a night to, every 5 minutes. It went from just having numbers to having a list of the day's cases to having all the lists of all the day's cases that you can access. And I think that those have been good. People have been asking me about the, number of kids and change it. And I want to do that. I have to find the time, right? But I think that the most important thing is to start with what you want, and then work from there. And then also, I think it's important, especially in the case of like moving data, right? Like what I mentioned, the accuracy and the timeliness are almost always fighting each other. And you just sort of have to pick what you think is the best balance to give your audience, the consumer of your dashboard, the information that they need to, operate or make their decisions that they're interested in.
Kind of a different question, but do you have any sense of why the FOIA data didn't agree with the dashboard data? Like what might drive that?
No, I know that I could find the tweet. When they changed their data on February 24th or whenever that was, I compared the case data from before to after, and that sort of same 30 or 3,000 cases sort of went missing. I mean, I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any excuse for it. Like it's the ones that they say are the right ones. Now, is it possible that you have a positive COVID test on Monday, you get the result on Tuesday, and you do what you think you're supposed to do and submit self-report form to say I have COVID, right? The information on that's not clear, right? They say on their sort of contact tracing sheet that it won't show up unless you fill out the self-report. But hold on one second. You talk about your dog coming in the background. I got my kid plugging in his tablet. iPad. He wants me to know. The thing says to fill out the form, right? But then they have seemed to be complaining that there's like duplicates, right? And it's basically shaming you if you don't do it, and then saying what there's duplicates, right? And so I don't know what's up with that. Maybe if somebody self-reports afterwards, instead of calling it a screening test, they call it a self-report test because they sort of want to say that those don't count as much, right? But I'm not sure why those wouldn't show up. You would think that they would have some sort of mechanism to check student ID numbers and not let people report the same student ID more than once in a week or something like that. I don't
know. We have a couple of questions here about the relationship with the CPSCTU thing. So one question, what is your take on how this incident impacted CPS discussions with CTU? And then another question about just asking if you can say more about the relationship to the CTU dispute. So
yeah, I don't have any insight onto how their discussions go. I'm not a teacher. I'm not, I know some teachers, right? But I don't have any insight into how their discussions work. So I don't know about that. I would assume they discussed it, but I don't know.
Another question. were the numbers reduced equally across all schools or only in certain areas?
That's a good question. I never looked into that. That is something that I could potentially look into. Based on, and I don't have any reason to not believe sort of the mechanism by which they explain this away by saying they're doing just closed cases, right? I never looked at individual schools. There was sort of that would have been like too much data for the average consumer to get. I suppose I could try to do a deep dive on that and see if there's anything there, but I haven't. I would assume that it would all depend on how fast contact tracers are, and what that means to where the schools are located. I couldn't tell you.
Another question. Did you get the sense that people understood the underlying data issue, or do you think that a lot of the sharing was like kind of based on like that, like a kind of clickbaity headline response? And like,
True.
do you think that distinction matters?
That's a good question. And it sort of comes back a little bit to outcomes, I think. If you want your outcome to be that the government is required to respond and fix something, I think it's ethical and important to have the data to back that up, right? But I think that having that sort of narrative and that clickbaity, and I would say that clickbaity is only when it like doesn't have the payload at the end, right? So I would a little, but you're right. Like I intended it to be scandalous, right? And I use that as a vehicle to get the word out. And so I think the two go hand in hand. I think that sometimes we get a little bit too wrapped up in the data and telling the exact right details that somebody's like, well, I lost interest, right? Goodbye, and we don't get done what we want to get done.
And I guess maybe, oh, no, I see one more audience question and we will probably only have time for one more. So what is your relationship with CPS now? Coming in from the audience.
I don't have a relationship with CPS. I like my kids' school, right? But I mean, I never really did. They ignore my DMs. They haven't unenrolled my kid from school, so that's good.
I feel like that would be proper scandal
also. Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly.
But okay, so we are basically at time. So I think we will wrap up there. But thank you so much. And thank you to all the audience members who asked great questions. So I think we will close it out. Josh, if you could put up the slide with the link to the post presentation Zoom. Folks are invited to head over there if you're interested. So bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom. And we'd love to see you there. Oh, and I think I have to say, go forth and hack. So